The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Greetings from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and welcome to another 1615 webinar. I'm Matthew Ellison, the president at 1615, and I also serve as a church missions coach. Really thrilled to bring you today's webinar. It's going to be an important one. It's entitled Mind the Gaps, Engaging the Church in Missionary Care. How do we engage the whole congregation in missionary care? This webinar will help churches promote the well-being, growth, effectiveness, and resilience of career missionaries through meeting their physical, spiritual, and emotional needs. Mind the gaps and engage in missionary care. In just a moment, I'm going to introduce you to our subject matter expert, but first, I want to let you know about a few upcoming events at 1615. We have a webinar on June 7th at Noon Mountain, which is the time of all our webinars. It's called Kingdom Business Projects. It's an end-to-end strategy for growing the underdeveloped church in the Muslim world. It's going to be led by Gordon Van Welchel and Eric Watt of Underground Church. So if you are interested in engaging in church planning in a Muslim context, I highly recommend you participate in this upcoming webinar. You can register at 1615.org. Again, an end-to-end strategy for growing the underground church in the Muslim world. We also have another webinar coming up, a very important topic, especially in the era that we find ourselves in. Who are the Muslims in America? What's their plan? What should be the reaction of God's people? The webinar will feature Keith Swartley of Encountering the World of Islam. Again, this is an absolutely relevant topic. How should the church in America respond to Muslims in our context in general, but also especially those who are here? If this is a question that you have or wondering how to mobilize your church to engage Muslims here, but also just how to help shape the heart and direction of your church, you'll definitely want to participate in this webinar. Then, of course, the Mission Table is a ministry of 1615. We are going into our third season. In fact, David Wilson, who's our presenter today, will be one of our table guests next season. But season 1 and 2 are available online to view. We bring together leading missions thinkers and practitioners, and we tackle some of the most critical and controversial topics that are impacting the missions world today. So the whole idea is we want to challenge churches to think deep about missions. We have a variety of topics on those 2 seasons. We hope you'll take advantage of this free resource. One of the things we talk about is poor mission thinking often leads to poor missions practice. So we have poor missions thinking in our crosshairs at the missions table. So please take advantage of this resource and let others know about it as well. So let me introduce David Wilson today. David is the author of the book Mind the Gaps, Engaging the Church in Missionary Care, and he serves currently as the Director of Church Relations at Avant Ministries. The mission of Avant is to glorify God by helping others enjoy His presence through planting and developing new churches in the unreached areas of the world. I want to thank you, David, for spending your time with us today and sharing your wisdom and experience. In just a moment, I'm going to hand the microphone over to David, but first I want to address our audience. Your phones are muted to preserve sound quality, so you can listen to your computer speakers or you can call in on the telephone, whichever you prefer. As questions come to mind today, please type them in the question and answer panel located in the GoToWebinar task panel on the upper right-hand side of your screen. We will be addressing questions for the last 15 to 20 minutes of our time together, and that's your opportunity to enter into dialogue with David about this very important topic. 135 people from around the world are registered for today's live webinar. And let me let you know that this webinar is also being recorded and will be available for download at 1615.org in the next week or so. David, I'm going to hand it over to you now, which takes just a second. And let me use this opportunity to again thank you for spending your time with us today and sharing your wisdom with us. David, it's all yours.
Great, Matthew. Thank you so much for that introduction, and just glad to be with everybody here gathered to talk about a very important topic. You know, God's heart is for caring for His people, and specifically those who are sent out from among us. And today's topic on engaging the church in missionary care is not necessarily a member care topic by, practitioner of member care, but it's more about creating a plan for churches to be established. Usually when we talk about member care, it's within the context of an agency, a sending organization. But today I'm going to be addressing churches, how you can be a part of this Great Commission involvement of going and caring for those who are serving on our behalf among the nations. So just to get us started, there's an African proverb I'd like to share with you. If you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, you go together. Just to set the stage of this topic, I don't want to talk to churches about doing missionary care or member care on your own, but partnering, how we can partner together with agencies. I've spent the last 20 years serving in local churches as a missions and outreach pastor, and now I'm serving in a missions organization, Avant Ministries here in Kansas City, and we have missionaries all around the world serving them in a variety of ways. So I'm kind of looking at it from two different perspectives here, but specifically targeting the church and the church's engagement and involvement in caring for those that are sent out. When I first started working as a missions pastor in a local church, there were 3 missionary scenarios, and I'm going to change the names, the places to protect those who are on the field, but just let me share with you a few of these scenarios that I was encountering as a mission pastor right away at the very beginning. There's a young single lady serving in Southeast Asia, and she was experiencing lots of loneliness and really needed help. And if you can think about it from your situation, if you have a young single person serving somewhere in the world, what can you do as a church to keep loneliness at bay, to keep her thriving in her ministry? So think through that as you hear this topic discussed today. Another missionary scenario that I want to bring up is there was a team in North Africa, and they were in deep conflict. They were doing good work, planting the church, working among unreached people groups, and serving the Lord in just a strategic way. But they were in conflict as a team. So what is it that the church can do to help teams who are serving the Lord together thrive with each other and to care for each other in the process of serving the Lord? And a third scenario, just to highlight that there are families who are living in places like the Middle East, and they have children. And sometimes children have special needs. Maybe they have some behavioral problems, maybe they have some medical problems, maybe they have just issues with living abroad as a third culture kid. So these 3 scenarios are what I faced as a mission pastor my first 6 months on the job. And it highlights a broad range of needs of missionaries. And so the church can be intentional and it can be proactive in helping missionaries be cared for in very strategic ways. Mind the Gaps was a book written by a group of people from a church who deeply loved and cared for their missionaries. Nearly 10 years ago, when I began serving as their mission pastor, I realized that this group of people that I was serving with in this church, they weren't your ordinary everyday mission committee members. They were not content on just sending a check every month to their mission organization and maybe praying for them every once in a while. They deeply cared about the well-being of their global workers. Every Sunday morning, 8 o'clock, never failed, there was a large group of people, very faithful believers, gathered together to pray specifically for those sent ones that were gathered. So every Sunday morning at 8 o'clock, these local saints would bring the names of their global saints before the throne of Almighty God. And it was just fascinating to be among a group of people that were not just passionate and caring about their missionaries, but they were skilled too. We had some people that had very good skills, and I thought, there's no way I can let these folks just get by with having a member care component at this one church. They need to share what they have corporately with the church at large, with the church around the world, because what they were coming up with was a model and as principles of being able to care for missionaries through the context of the local church in proactive and in very intentional ways. This was no ordinary group, and they had something that they needed to share. So that's why Mind the Gaps came along. They identified the spiritual, the emotional, the practical, and the professional effectiveness needs of missionaries that were serving on their behalf in the world. Now, I recently wrote a blog. It's about a backpacking trip that I made to the Eastern Sierra Mountains. Every year I go on a trip to the Sierra Mountains, and bottom line, this one trip, well, my map got wet, the batteries in my GPS unit, they died, and that solar battery charger that was supposed to be in my backpack, well, it was left behind in my garage. I was lost. I was lost in a great big forest. And I needed a guide. I needed a way to navigate that complex terrain to be able to make my way through this, these mountains, this wilderness area. Now, Regis, about 6 months ago, I started working as the Director of Church Relations here at Avant Ministries. And I sometimes hear returning missionaries describe their visits to their sending church just like if they were lost in a forest like I was. Their church had been faithful in sending that monthly check, but you know, when they showed up, they didn't recognize the person. Unfortunately, with all the busyness of the local church, out of sight is out of mind. It becomes a default position. And I had a missionary recently joke around about how she really liked that 10-year-old picture of her that was on the wall in the foyer of a church. She liked it because she looked 10 years younger, but you know, nobody recognized her. She had changed quite a bit since that 10-year-old picture was taken. And there was a different pastor in the church. There was a different missions committee altogether. And the building was even different. They built a sanctuary while she was gone. So today, I just want to wrestle with a few truths here. The Great Commission is a mandate to go into all the world. And we're doing that strategically through sending out well-trained, highly gifted missionaries that are facilitated through mission agencies. Avant Ministries is one of them. The church is the primary sender in this relationship, though. The church in Acts 13 is identified as the sender, the one who affirms the call of missionaries, the one that approves this call to mission service. So how can we, the missionary, the agency, and the church, work together effectively to make sure that this triad is well taken care of? You know, everyone is in agreement. Everything's working great. But when disagreement happens, then we need to start working more proactively and intentionally about making sure that we're all working off the same script, off the same strategy, and doing the thing that God has called us all to do together. My hope is to reach out today to churches to help you organize your missionaries so that they won't fall through the gaps. And actually, that's why we titled the book Mind the Gaps, is because every time we talked about missionaries and involvement with the church, we kept using that word, gaps. You know, there was a gap in care. There's a gap between the church and the agency. There's a gap between one missionary from one agency over here and another missionary from another agency over here. So we as a church, we had multiple agencies that we were working with. So how can that be sorted out within the context of the church? We began to read books like well, Doing Member Care Well, Worth Keeping, Enhancing Missionary Vitality. There's a whole section of books in the bookstore that are about member care, but you know, most of them were written from the perspective of the agency and had very little, maybe a few chapters here and there about what the church can contribute to it. But we thought, okay, that's a gap that we can fill. As a church, we can fill that gap of a resource, a book, just to contribute to the conversation of what it's like to serve as missionary care workers from the local church. Some of the topics that we read about missionary attrition, missionary retention, soul care for the cross-cultural worker, and just being good senders. You know, how can we be good senders as a church? But you know, we found very little on the church, so that's why we came up with this book. We also traveled to conferences, to seminars, to workshops, all on the topic of member care, which That was great for us. We got a lot of information. We really love spending time with the different agencies that put on these conferences. And we started to notice, though, that most of the attendees were from sending agencies. We were amazed, that there weren't very many people from the church. There weren't very many church-based member care teams in existence. Even though we were honored to be there, it started making us think, where is the church? Where is the church in the process of caring for missionaries? I'm sure they're out there caring for missionaries. Sometimes it's reactive instead of intentional. Sometimes it's not as proactive as it should be. So to add to the conversation, to contribute to our global workers and to make sure that global workers are healthy and resilient, we made sure that our first stop as a missionary care team in a church was to visit the member care departments of the agencies of all the missionaries that we worked with. And I started to realize, man, the mission agency is a very, very busy place. There are a lot of frontline workers out there, and there are people who are really caring for folks. But I just want to give you a little perspective on that. Mission agency is a very busy place. They've got lots of workers all around the world. And just to fill you in on just some statistics, some data from just my organization, just Avant Ministries in Kansas City, we have about 458 global workers all around the world, and that includes adults and children. And these global workers are scattered all over, and they're doing church planting in a variety of different topics. And here in the organization, we have one director of member care. Now, her name is Candace, and she is fabulous. She's doing a great job. She's got a PhD from Fuller Seminary. She has a very clear understanding of the needs of workers, especially in workers in our precarious places in the world, those hard, difficult places. And she's really coming up with a great strategy to be able to care for workers. Now, she has 15 member care providers who are located regionally around the world. Those are the folks that are boots on the ground. And if you think about it for a moment, that ratio, there's 15 member care people for 458 workers. Just to do the math on it, that's a 30-to-1 ratio. Now that's a really, really, really good ratio. I've studied other mission organizations that have a ratio of 60-to-1, 80-to-1, even 90-to-1. So 30-to-1 is a really good ratio, and we're doing a fantastic job on that front. But to just flip this ratio upside down for a moment, let's think about it from the perspective of the church. The average church, let's just say that they have 750 members. Now they support 10 missionaries, 10 missionary families. If this church is properly engaged with the Mind the Gaps model, and if they're actively involved in caring for their global workers, then we can flip this ratio by just saying, for every one missionary family, they have 75 church members behind. That's a 1 to 75 ratio, and 1 to 75 is far better than 30-to-1. But that's if all of the members of the church are properly engaged in caring for missionaries. So in the church, there's a variety of skills and abilities and resources that even the agency doesn't have. An average church is going to have somebody that's a medical professional, somebody that's a business professional, a teacher, some administrative assistants, there's marriage and family therapists. So every church just about has people in it who are specialists in ways that they can care for missionaries in ways that even the agency can't provide. In my 20 years of serving the church as a mission pastor, I was always able to find somebody within the church who could help a missionary with a problem. Here's just a few of the examples, and realize I'm still changing names and places to protect those workers on the field. But if a missionary had a problem with their children's homeschooling, I was able to contact a teacher and get a teacher from my congregation to connect with them to help them with that homeschooling problem. If they had a rash, now this gets a little dicey, it's kind of funny to, a missionary says that they have a rash and they want to have a doctor look at it. I had a doctor come into my office, sat down, did a Skype call with the missionary, and it's just a little weird to have a doctor sitting in my office looking at a rash at a missionary somewhere in the Middle East. So that doctor was able to do a Skype call, recommend a treatment, and that missionary was able to have their rash fixed. A business's mission worker in Vietnam had some issues, and I had a business, a local entrepreneur, businessman, to help him with a business plan so that he could set up a really solid business there in that Southeast Asia. When I sensed some marriage difficulties with a couple one time, they were in North Africa, I arranged for them to meet with a marriage and family therapist for a week in Paris. They were able to have some intense couples therapy and then some follow-up over Skype, but they were able to actually spend time with a real marriage and family therapist because we were able to take them out of their context, put them in a nice place for a week, and have some intense therapy. So a church has a wealth of resources if only we are proactive and intentional about getting them involved. You know, sometimes it's the simple things to care for missionaries. Simple things like communication. It's like sending a note of encouragement. Hey, we're praying for you. You know, a lot of missionaries say, I just sent out a newsletter and prayer letter for to 250 of my supporters, and I only got one response that they got it. I don't even know if they're getting my newsletters. So if you think about it from that perspective, just at least send an acknowledgement email saying, hey, I got your email, I'm praying for you. But you know, simple thing of saying, hi, I'm praying for you, that gets forgotten over time. When people go out on the field for months, they go without hearing from anybody from their senders. Without a plan in place to stay in touch, these good intentions often turn into disregard or neglect over time. So I'm not talking about doing anything more than having a specific plan in place and working on that plan. And that's what a member care team, missionary care team in your local church can do. It can provide a very intentional plan on keeping communication together, keeping people in the know of what the needs of the missionaries are, and then helping them turn those needs into fulfillment and provision from the Lord. So I'm going to begin my slideshow now. Here's what we came up with as a church for a model for effective member care, missionary care. Now, this is what I would like to share with you churches who desire to have some tools and some coaching. Please don't take this as a model that you plug into your system, to your church, to your missionary plan, but maybe as principles. I'm just sharing with you what we did at our church, but maybe take this as principles, and you're going to have to work out all the details yourself. Make it yours. Don't try to just copy what we do or replicate what we do, but use these principles to get your specific missionary care team going. So basically, what is the Mind the Gaps? It's a church-based missionary care. It's intentional. It's proactive, not reactive. We're not waiting around for something bad to happen and then meet the need, but we're actually anticipating the needs and being on the forefront. It's non-evaluative, and this is an important place to stop for a moment. You can't just make your missions committee the missionary care team because the missions committee has to be an evaluative entity. Actually, your pastor, the pastor of missionaries, the pastor of your church, the elders of your church, those are all people who are evaluative by nature. They're the ones that's going to have to make the phone call at some point in the missionary's life and, you know, we can't support you anymore. There's a non-safe attitude that a missionary has with this group. Now, the pastor of the church can certainly be a very, very safe person. The elders of the church can be safe people. They all can be, but from the perspective of the missionary, you got to think about it from their side. They may not be able to share everything that's going on in their life with people who can pull the plug, so to say. So it needs to be a group of safe people, people who will keep confidence. And so that's why we've decided to not make it part of the missions committee, but it was a separate team altogether that's separated by a very clear line of distinction, and they keep confidences very, very well. This team is also very relational. It's forming that partnership. It's not just the people who are going to be caring for the missionaries, but it's people who are going to engage the rest of the church in caring for missionaries and serve as a bridge to the agency. So that partnership between the missionary, the agency, and the church is kind of managed and taken care of by this missionary care team. It's mutually deferential, meaning that we know what our roles are. The missionary, the agency, and the church all have very clear roles. And sometimes it requires, it gets complicated, so sometimes it requires a memorandum of understanding. The MOU is a very valuable tool sometimes between your missionary and your church and your agency. So it kind of helps draw the lines. You know, some agencies, they say that that person, the field leader, the person that's on the mission field, that's the leader of the team, well, they're the ones that can call the shots. They're the ones that can do the hard calls when things go wrong. Some organizations say, no, you know, the church is the one that calls the shot. We won't pull this missionary off this mission field unless the church says okay. And other times it's the agency that calls the shots. And the agency says, you know, whatever headquarters says, that's what we do. The field leader can disagree, but they're still going to do what the agency says. So understanding roles, being submissive, being courteous and respectful of each other, and being non-superior. So having this expectations all cleared out on the page, we know who does what, and we respect who's in the lead chair, who's riding the horse on the front. You know, that's kind of the attitude that we need to go into with this mutually deferential part. So why is Mind the Gaps needed? The word outsourcing is the thing that pops up most when I hear from churches and from agencies. I love that word because it really shares what's going on within the church. I don't like this quote, but I heard it recently, said that the church has outsourced theological education, theology, to the Bible schools. The church has outsourced discipleship to parachurch organizations. And the church has outsourced missions and the Great Commission to missionary sending agencies. So what we wanted to do with Mind the Gaps is to stop the outsourcing of member care to the agency. That's not saying that the agency is not needed. It's not saying that the agency is not a vital component, but the church shouldn't just pay for that service by just sending a check. They need to be intimately involved, and to stop outsourcing member care and to be intimately involved with your agency and with those missionaries that are serving. We love Acts 13. Acts 13 is where you know, Paul and Barnabas was going out, and the church leaders actually heard God speak to them and say, set apart for me Paul and Barnabas for the work that I've called them to do. And so God was affirming the role of the church, the leaders, and saying, we are going to, this church is going to be intimately involved in sending them out, making sure that they're involved. Ralph Winter is one of those great thinkers that one point said, our efforts today in any part of the world will be most effective only if both of these two structures, the church and the agencies, are fully and properly involved and supportive of each other. And for the purpose of having resilient missionaries going to hard places. You know, there's not very many places in the world that have low-hanging fruit. All that fruit of sharing the gospel and people coming to Christ, they're in hard places now. And we need to make sure that that resilience is taken care of. And resilience means they're personally healthy, they're relationally healthy, and they're spiritually healthy. As I was a missions pastor, I started thinking through how can we build a church-based team. And some of the people that we recruited onto the team, this is just a short list of some of the people that were on my church team, but you can think of far more people that could be a part of this church-based missionary team. But we had a marriage and family therapist. We had people who were former missionaries. We had parents of missionaries. And one of the cool things was, if you're a church that's really actively engaged in raising up the next generation of missionaries and really trying to get people to go out and hear God's voice, calling them to the nations, then engage those future missionaries. Get some young people on the team. Get some people out there because they have energy, they usually don't understand the fact that they can't do something, so they are actually willing to try new things and to get things going. So engage those young people, future missionaries, people that are in your pipeline, trying to get them engaged in ministry. Now, we had a philosophy of effective ministry, and I've got to tell you, if some of my team is listening here on this from the church, that was a painful 6 months trying to hack out this philosophy of effective ministry. It spent lots of nights, lots of emails back and forth, changing this word to that word. And I don't want to rob you other churches of the joy and the pleasure of being able to hammer out a philosophy of effective ministry, because it was painful, but the joy came when we all had it and we're all on one page, one script, we're in agreement, and everything was working well. So this is an important step for you. And if you're reading the book, it highlights kind of what we went through, but this is basically the purpose statement here: to promote the well-being, growth, effectiveness, and sustainability of a church's career missionaries through meeting their physical, spiritual, and emotional needs. Now, it took me, 6 or 8 seconds to do that, but it took us 6 months to hammer it out. So don't take it lightly. Don't just take this, copy it, and paste it into yours, but take this as a sample, but work on it for yourself. It's well worth the effort. Additionally, we had some core values that we had to hammer out, so this was all a part of that poem that we came up with. So some core values: care through grace-oriented relationships. So these are not evaluative. Remember that word. We came up with non-evaluative. We're not going to evaluate how effective these missionaries are, but we want to care for them gracefully through some of their problems, their issues, the things that they're struggling with. Having an awareness of gaps of care not met by their agency. That means you got to get on the phone. You got to go for a visit. These agencies, and I speak of one serving in an agency right now, we love to have visitors. We have people that come into the offices here, and we want to sit down with you and talk through all the issues that your missionaries are going through, so that we as an agency can be a support for you as a church. Third is to promote the congregational awareness and involvement. Now, there were layers, there were levels of involvement. You know, not every church member in the church knew all the secrets of the missionaries and the problems that they were going with. Very small group of people held the confidence, but then there were small groups that were adopting missionaries and praying for them, and they would even have Skype calls with them on, like, you know, their Wednesday night Bible studies when they met. They would actively sit there with their missionaries, pray for them, see them on the screen. Then there were those who would actually go and visit the missionaries on the field. There were those who were on the mission team, the missions core team and the missions committee, that were caring for them in more specific ways. So there's a congregational awareness, but then there's a congregational involvement aspect that takes place, and so it's layers of involvement. And then the fourth one is encouraging openness through confidentiality. And you got to really hold confidences if you're going to be a safe person, a safe place for missionaries to open up to. So just for our sake, confidentiality, this is that you would find this in most marriage and family therapists, counselor handbooks. There's not much new here that we created, but this is just basically legal limits, moral limits, and ethical limits of confidentiality. We have to really understand that there are limits to how much we can hold confidence with our missionaries. And that confidentiality policy had to be approved. It couldn't just be something that we came up with, but it needed to be approved by the church leaders, the elders, the pastors. It needed to be approved by the agency. The agency needed to sign off on, hey, just a worst case scenario here for you. Hey, we've got a missionary that's, they're having some problems with their children and they're not disciplining their children very properly, and so we're really afraid of the health of the children right now. So if the church says that we're not going to tell the agency that there's a problem that severe, that significant, then that could be an issue that could really draw a a problem between the church and the agency. There can be some hurt feelings and problems there. So you really kind of have to have the confidentiality policy in place so that everybody knows where you are in the process. And then the confidentiality policy. Here's just an excerpt from it. All communication with the members of the missionary care team is confidential. We want you to be able to talk with us openly about your needs so that we may be of help. The only times we will break this agreement of confidentiality are as follows. When a dangerous situation arises, or when we see that personal struggles significantly interfere with one's work role. And here's how the best practice, if you want to talk best practices here, from a church perspective, it's really not a good idea for a church to go and tattle on their missionary on what they're doing to the agency. Probably the best practice would be, you know, you guys have a really dangerous situation that's coming up. I'm going to stay on the phone right now, and just as a scenario here, if you're talking to your missionary and that dangerous situation arises, you say, you know, I'm going to stay on the phone right now, and I want you to call your member care person at your agency and tell them right now about what's going on. So that way, it's not you being the bad guy and tattling on them, but you're helping them understand the severity of the problem and that you're giving them a solution to come out. Now, if they refuse to do that, then yeah, you're going to have to do something. There's another less severe, though that's worst case scenario, there's something less severe. If they're just doing something that their struggles are interfering with their work, you say, I think you should call that person at your agency that you need to talk to, your field leader, and you need to talk to them about this. I want you to do that, and I'm going to give you a week. And in a week, I'm going to call that person at your agency, and I'm going to say, have you had a conversation with Joe and Sally about this? And then that way it gives them the opportunity, it gives them some space, and it gives them an opportunity to share their struggles and their problems. And then when you call and you talk to that agency, you're not saying that you know about it, but you just say, have you talked to them? Have they shared anything with you? So that way you're kind of keeping them accountable, but you're also helping them help themselves in the process. So here's just some of the nuts and bolts, things that you'll find in the book. And I don't want to kind of describe too much. I want to describe the why that we came up with Mind the Gaps during this webinar. But the hows and the whats and all that kind of stuff is included in the book and on our website. We'll give that to you here in a little bit. But the website has a lot of more in-depth stuff. But basically, in the book, you'll find predicting missionary success as a chapter. One of the best ways to care for your missionaries is to make sure you're sending out well-qualified, highly trained people who have skills and abilities. And you can go through this predicting missionary success chapter and find out some of the little idiosyncrasies that missionaries might have that would be successful in the field. Also, candidate selection. If you are looking at sending out church planters from your church, but a young person comes up and says, I want to do poverty alleviation, there may be an issue with the amount of care that they get over time, because you're really wanting to do church planting, but they're wanting to alleviate poverty. So there's a disservice that's going to happen if you start doing that. So candidate selection on the front end could be one of the most caring things that you as a church can do, is to carefully select your candidates well for doing the job that you want to send them out to do. And that leads us to the alignment of the strategic focus of the church. You want to make sure that you have a strategic focus, that you're really doing something that your church is proud of, that you can feel good about, and that you can actively, fully support and love what you do. So Matthew Ellison's 1615, when he goes to churches, he does some seminars and just helps the church refocus, re-gear, and figure out what it is that your church needs to do in this world through the Great Commission calling that it has. So I'm going to stop right there. The rest of these nuts and bolts, we talk about transitions, we talk about all the other things. But for right now, I'm going to just go to Matthew, and I've already introduced your 1615 thing, and we're going to take some questions.
That's great. David, this is really helpful stuff. I hope it's been a blessing for our audience here. I want to remind you this is your time to interact with David, to ask any questions. The GoToWebinar task panel, once again, is located on the right-hand side of your screen. Let me take controls over here, David. And then I will start fielding some questions to you. Okay, David, this comes from Sicily. I'm a missionary without an agency. How does a missionary connect with an agency? Is that something that a church has to do? So I'm assuming this person has a sending church. That's kind of how I see that. Or can a missionary seek an agency and remain on good terms with the church?
Yeah, so that gets really complicated. Vast majority of the people that come through the agency since I've been here, and the vast majority as a missions pastor, that have mass majority of people that have come to me as missionary candidates have said, hey, I just discovered this organization, this agency. I think God's calling me to be a missionary, and this is the organization that I'm going to go through. So a lot of the times we get candidates, the pipeline begins with the agency directly with the individual, and we have a recruitment team, we have a mobilization team that can help place people. So it usually comes through there first. Now, that's not necessarily the ideal. The ideal would be that the church actually has a really good relationship with an agency to begin with, and then when their young people start growing up, they say, hey, I really feel strongly that I want to serve through my church being sending me out. What agency would you recommend? That would be the recommended thing to go with. So if the church that has sent you out to Sicily now, if your church could recommend an agency that they are familiar with, maybe somebody that they have a good relationship with, then that would be a really good starting point. Otherwise, you can also contact 1615 or even Avant Ministries, and we can see if there's ways that we can help you through that too.
Yeah, I think that's good advice, David. Again, there's not enough information there. There probably needs to be gathering some more intelligence to give some direction. But if that church that sent you is truly a sending church, I would defer to them first and have a conversation with them and let them know that you are wanting to connect with an agency to have that triad that you spoke of, David, and see if you can get some direction from them. So again, David's available to talk to you at Avant or 1615 as well. There's a note here. Can I get David's PowerPoint? Absolutely. This webinar will be available, again, within the next week online. And David, will you make the PowerPoint available as well?
Sure, yes.
Great. So, yeah, we can make those available to anyone who wants that directly. Otherwise, the presentation will be available online. This is from Trip Rogers. This is a great question, David. As you were walking through, kind of the overview of the book, it popped into my mind as well. How can we walk our church through the Mind the Gap book in an effective way?
So the book is it's laid out with a variety of chapters, and there's directions, and it's got questions like getting on board at the end of every chapter and at the end of every section. So it's laid out to be read as a team, as a group. So if you have I would say start first with a leader. Make sure you have a leader that's in place that would be the one that that starts the meetings, that calls the meeting together. So a person that can just kind of rally the troops in a way. You start with that person, and then you start filling in some of the roles, as I mentioned before. If there's some strategic roles. Now, let's say if your church really is heavily into business as mission. Well, you want to make sure that you have a business entrepreneur on your team. You want to make sure that there's somebody there that can speak in as an entrepreneur to entrepreneurs that are on the field. But other than that, there's therapists, there's other people who are interested in caring for missionaries. So you start with building the team, and then you get them together, maybe having the pastor involved, maybe having an elder involved at the very beginning, getting their feedback and input. Those are very important things because most of the time the pastor is the one that either, I think I got this from you, Matthew. The pastor either holds the key or the padlock to leadership in the missions world. So make sure that the pastor is intimately involved in the process of getting the church started in this process.
That's good. I lifted that from George Murray, by the way, so
okay.
Just to give attribution there, but it is really good. I just want to make a comment there. I think this is really important. The churches that 1615 has coached, that have launched a strategic vision, and as a part of that, they develop these missionary care teams, David. The ones that have seen the most fruit in with the care teams are those that do train them. They don't just randomly say, hey, read a book and do your best, but they take the development of that missionary care team very seriously. And what you described, just like that. So, it's not see what happens, do your best. It is, in fact, a training that they have consistent nights and they develop them. Some churches I know have even commissioned their missionary care teams when they commission their missionaries because they see it as such a vital role to the health and the effectiveness of the missionary that's going out. So however you do it, I would make sure it's intentional, it's deliberate, and people understand just how serious it is and important it is for the church. This is from Ruth Howard. I am presently a missionary serving with an agency, but would love to have my sending churches more involved in my support beyond finances. I've tried to encourage it during furloughs, but have not really been successful. How can I encourage my church to mind the gaps without seeming pushy? Great question, Ruth.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. And sometimes you've got to find that right person. In a church, you need to find the one that can actually hold the ropes. I mean, that's a term that goes way back, but the one person that really cares for you, is an advocate for you, and you find that one person in the church and you say, I'm really in need of my church to be involved in my ministry here, and you find that one person and you get them to be your champion, your advocate, that person that's the cheerleader for you, and you develop the strategy. Now, there are two people in the church. As a missions pastor and serving in the church, I've always wanted to make sure that there are two people who are my best friends in the church. One is the worship leader of the church, the person who leads worship from up front. And the reason that person is most important on my list of people in the church to make good friendship with is because they're the only person in the church that has more stage time than the senior pastor. Senior pastor may get up there and preach a sermon every Sunday, but the worship leader is the one that, when there's power in singing and praising and worshiping God, that worship leader can just turn a two-sentence turn in the whole worship experience and say, our missionary in such and such a place is in need right now. I want you to just turn your prayer attention to them. I mean, that person is so vital to the gospel in the church, but he's also vital in the second person in the church that you really need to be best friends with is the church administrator, the person that the senior pastor's assistant. Because just as in marriage, you probably heard in my big fat wedding that the husband is the head of the family, but the wife is the neck, and she can turn the head. Well, that relationship is very similar to the senior pastor and the administrative assistant in the church. The senior pastor is the one that calls the shots, but that secretary, the one that answers the phones and does all that, she has a lot of pull in that office. So make sure you make best friends with them. So those are two people to kind of build a relationship with as well.
I want to suggest something for Ruth as well. I think a lot of times we don't understand just, again, the seriousness of missionary care and just how important it is. And the book of 3 John is one of the best examples in the Bible of just how important it is. So John, in that book, commends Gaius because he's walking in the truth, and that's manifested by how he's caring for itinerant missionaries. And he says, you will do well to send them on their way in a manner worthy of God, because they've left home, they've forsaken all in order to proclaim the name of Christ among the Gentiles. And I think for a lot of people, missionary care is ho-hum. It's not viewed as this incredibly important ministry, but in 3 John, it's exactly what makes this godly old man so very happy. So what I'm driving at here is there's a biblical basis for excellent missionary care. And the practical stuff is essential, but I think first we have to deal with the heart and understand how important it is to God. And on that note, there is a message online, Ruth, if you're interested, or anyone else that's listening. It's called Caring for Missionaries in a Manner Worthy of God. It's at 1615.org under messages. It's a free download, or you can listen there online. But what it does is it really elevates the importance of missionary care as high as it can possibly be elevated. And when you have the right heart, and then you couple it with these practical head-hand things that Dave is talking about, it's a powerful combination. So I wanted to mention that.
Nice.
Cliff Lusk. For a smaller church, say 75 members, what do you recommend for them to do that would be different than a large church? That's a good question.
Yeah, and never underestimate what a small church can do. I have a really good friend that's got a smaller church in a 50 to 60 member church, but they've already sent out 3 families in the last 3 years from among them. So, that ratio, that maybe only three families, but that's a huge ratio. So those families that were sent out from that church, they need a support network as well. And actually, the smaller church can be far more intimately involved. It's not just about money, it's not about the numbers of people, but it's how intimately involved. And they actually send workers, send out short-term teams to help their workers that are on the field. So for nuts and bolts type things, I would say having maybe a few people. You don't have to have like a team, maybe 2 or 3 people who are just focused on caring for their missionaries. You don't have to have this larger strategy for that, because at some point that smaller church could grow as a result of the missions involvement, and then you need to start thinking differently. So each church, each size of church needs to have a different strategy in place that fits the needs of your workers. And it would be interesting to know how many workers you have there on the field in a church of 75, but I would say that you don't need a huge team of people, but a smaller team, but you still need to think through some of these very vital things like confidentiality. And just as a warning, I understand that in smaller churches, sometimes prayer requests can turn into gossip requests, and those, you got to kind of guard yourself with confidentiality, especially in those kind of situations. So gossip is a problem in the church worldwide, but I think smaller churches sometimes have a greater handle on it.
That's good. Let's see here, David. This comes from my friend Mike Brown, who's a pastor in Burbank, California. I'm actually coaching their church right now. Mike, how you doing? He says, in looking at creating a larger team from among the whole church to be invested in missionary care, is this best done through a formal structure, or team leading the charge, or asking individuals to identify a missionary the church supports and to do so themselves?
Yeah, so that's a both and. There's some churches who do everything through their small groups. So their small group ministry does both missionary care and as well as doing the small group ministry of Bible study and so forth. So I know a couple of churches who have, every time a missionary gets sent out, they have a small group of supporters. They call them champion groups or something like that. And those people, their primary reason for existing is to care for that missionary that's been sent out. And that's an extraordinarily valuable tool. The thing is, they have to constantly be trained. So you have to not just have, say, okay, small group, you're you're the small group, you're the care team for this missionary right here. You have to monitor it, you have to train them, you have to keep them. So that kind of requires an organizational team to kind of keep going. And it depends on how many missionaries. One of the churches that I'm thinking about has 80 missionaries on the field. So each of their small groups that are champion groups for those 80 missionaries, they have to come together at some point and talk about best practices, and usually through a newsletter. Newsletters are very effective because one of the things that I heard that they would do is they would celebrate. So this small group did something special for their missionary, and so they would put that in the newsletter, and what that would do is have a ripple effect, and all the other small groups would start competing with each other, trying to outdo, how they're caring for their missionaries. So that competition is pretty healthy, especially in a church that decides to do it that way.
Yeah, that's good. I wanted to address that as well. I think I'd mentioned some of the churches that I've seen that have had the most fruitful missionary care are ones that intentionally, deliberately trained up teams. And the idea that kind of comes to my mind is if you leave it to organic only, sometimes it doesn't happen. Kind of this idea which everybody's job is nobody's job. But, so having some intentional teams that take responsibility for caring for the missionaries, but at the same time encouraging people who just have a heart for the missionaries to identify those needs and come alongside them. So maybe it is like you described, Mike, or David, a both-and situation. Let's see here. We have time for 2 more questions here. Let me find you a good one, David, as we wrap this up. Our church has about 15 active families that we significantly support. Is there value in having a missionary care team for each family, or one overseeing all 15?
Yeah, so that goes to the other question as well, because you can have a missionary care team, as I have described it through Mind the Gaps, and their job is to make sure that the missionaries are cared for. It's not necessarily them doing the care work themselves, but to be the ones that's facilitating the training, facilitating the workshops, the seminars, reading the books together. So that care team that would be coordinating the overall missionary care strategy. So they're thinking more on the 30,000-foot level. They're really not necessarily doing it hands-on, but they're involving the small groups to do it. And I think it, especially in a group of 15, where you have 15 workers, that may be your best bet, is to do that type of ministry, is with a care team that does the strategic planning part, and then having the smaller groups of care team providers underneath them.
That's good. So here's one more question. This comes from Ken. And folks, I'm sorry I was unable to address all your questions today. But again, thank you for your interaction here. How does worker care work when a worker is in a restricted access country through business's mission? To link a worker with a business and a church compromises the business interest in the country. How do you handle that, David?
So there's layers here. You got business's mission, so that's a different type of a worker. You've got restricted access nations, and sometimes your only access to them is through very concealed type communication. And so you really have to have more boots on the ground in those kinds of situations. I think you're probably needing somebody that's going to be traveling to that area of the world more frequently. It's probably something that can't be handled over email, over Skype calls. There's a lot of secure communication things, but you're probably going to need to invest a little bit more heavily in getting boots on the ground workers out there to visit them. And I'm thinking 2-3 times a year. That would be far more frequently than what you would normally do for missionaries in other access nations.
On that note, I worked with a church several years ago, and they have deployed several families for church planning in Morocco among Muslims, and they developed a specialized missionary care team. So this was, kind of a one-off situation, and that care team was trained with the having in mind the unique situation of their workers. And they ended up starting a physical therapy clinic in North Africa. And a businessman from the congregation was mobilized to be a part of that care team, and he serves as a consultant to the business. So, same principles, but modified according to the missionary situation in the field. So again, I wish we had more time. Still have a lot of people online. I want to thank everyone for listening in. Let me remind everyone about a few upcoming events. If you were not here when the webinar started, we have a webinar called Kingdom Business Project. If you're interested in church planting in the Muslim world, you want to be a part of this. The presenter, Gordon Van Welchel, and his associate, Eric Watt, will be talking about an end-to-end strategy for growing the underground church in the Muslim world. And then on a similar note, really excited about this webinar. Again, in the current era we live in America First era, I think this is such a critical conversation. Who are the Muslims in America? What's their plan? And what should our reaction as the church be? This is going to be featuring Keith Swartley of Encountering the World of Islam. That's on June 21st. You can register at 1615.org. I believe this is an important message for the church today. Then again, the mission table. We tackle critical, controversial topics that are impacting the missions world today. In fact, several of those are Muslim topics, a variety of others as well. Please visit missiontable.org and you can join in the conversation with leading missions thinkers that are addressing these very important issues. David, I'm going to leave your slide up there for a little bit so people can get your email, can learn a little bit more about Avant Ministries. I want to remind everyone that this webinar has been recorded and it will be available probably within the next week at 1615.org. That is our website, 1615.org. And again, want to thank everyone for participating, and especially David for you sharing out of your experience at the church and now at Avant. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
I'm Matthew Ellison for 1615, signing off.